Good evening, world historians. Last week we paused to look at the rise of nationalism in the industrial societies of 19th century Europe. And this week we're going to enter the third and final unit of this class, which is looking at the tumultuous 20th century, which began obviously in 1900. As you can see here by this map, dominated by the great powers of Europe and their colonial possessions, particularly in Asia and in Africa, as we've seen with King Leopold's ghost. So today I actually want to step back a little bit and look at also East Asia in the build-up to this period, particularly comparison of China and Japan. However, I also want us to think about America, the United States of America. Of course, the United States is part of the world, but it was also in 1900 becoming a world power. It was becoming an imperial power. And of course, we tend to think that the United States is separate from the history of European colonialism. There were no American official delegates, at least at the Berlin Conference in 1884. And we like to think that the United States of America, having been a counter-revolutionary or a revolutionary movement in 1776, having given birth to the United States in revolution against Great Britain, that somehow in our DNA to be against imperialism. However, in the 1890s, especially controversially, America starts to engage in empire building. We go to war with Spain in 1898, obtain territory including the Philippines, which had been a Spanish colony up until that time. And in the Pacific, especially, we see the build-up of American power in the 19th, early 20th century, 100 years, which of course will lead up to the outbreak of the Second World War with the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So there's about 100 years of colonial or imperial rivalry between the Japanese and the United States, which goes back really to the 1850s. This is actually a Japanese painting illustration rather from 1853 showing the so-called Black Fleet, which were, if you like, the hybrid ships of their day. They were fueled by coal power, but also by sail, led by the American naval Commodore Matthew Perry, not to be confused with the actor Matthew Perry, who was on the sitcom Friends, but Matthew Perry, who in 1853 arrives off the coast of Japan bearing a letter from Millard Fillmore, who at that time was president of the United States, demanding that Japan, which at that time was closed to the outside world effectively for trade and commerce, open its doors to the particularly to American merchants, American industry, and gain access to, or grant access to the world markets. Now, this is a point of contrast, 1853 with Japan, the arrival of these American warships off the coast of Japan, echoes of Chung He. But of course, in China itself, at that time, China by now has become largely, not entirely, but largely closed from the world economy, going back to the 18th century. Sorry, you had the Qianlong Emperor in 1757, imposed a system of trade restrictions throughout China, in which was referred to as the Canton system, after the city of Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou, to limit foreign trade to really the merchant district of the city of Guangzhou, to a group of about 7 or 8 Chinese merchants who are known as the Kohong, were granted a monopoly on foreign trade, and the rest of the Chinese interior economy was essentially closed off to foreign trade. And this again kind of goes back to this idea that China at the beginning of the 19th century had become this sort of sleeping giant, but also that it believed that it did not need the assistance of foreign trade, foreign innovation, to keep its economy running along. This is this sort of giant economy of the 19th century. And the problem with the Canton system, although it placed great wealth and prosperity into the hands of these few merchants, it really kind of cut off China from the rest of the world, and particularly in a way led to kind of underground black market in commodities that the Chinese had in high demand, chief of which, among which was, in fact, opium, which we all know, of course, opium. Today we have the opiate crisis in the United States, but as Robert Marx points out, in 19th century China, something like 10% of the Chinese adult population were addicted to opium, which of course will lead to tremendous, not just human, but also economic suffering and erosion of civil society. And you can see here two contrasting images of opium, which in most of the world at that time was actually a quite legal product. You could go to the pharmacist and buy opium over the counter. You didn't even need a prescription from your physician. But the picture on the top, of course, portrays opium as being this kind of exotic, wonderful, relaxing drug, and you can see these guys smoking their opium pipes, and the guy on the right there sort of raising the roof, looking like he's having a great old time. This, of course, was a studio photograph. This was a completely posed photograph. The photograph on the bottom right, I think you see much more clearly the actual reality of the opium dens, where many Chinese, particularly men, but also some women, were addicted in the 19th century, and the reality was far from romantic, far from an appealing picture. However, the Chinese government, in attempting to tackle the opium problem in the 19th century, bans the importation of opium, which had been grown primarily in India and was mostly traded by the British at that time. Banned the opium trade, which in the 19th century then leads to conflict with the British, and in fact what becomes known as the First Opium War, a hugely unequal military conflict between the Qing dynasty of Imperial China and the British and the British East India Company based in India, which actually had its own fleet, including steam-powered warships, up against many of the Chinese fleet, which were really antiquated. And as you can see in this summary here, the Chinese stood very little chance against the industrial military might of the British. Treaty of Nanjing, 1842, concluded the First Opium War, abolished those Chinese trade monopolies, opened up the Chinese economy, particularly 5 key ports which were opened up to British trade, including the port of Hong Kong, which actually remained as a colonial possession in British hands until quite recently, until 1997. And Britain also demanded from the Chinese government $6 million in financial compensation, which they claimed they were owed because of the destruction of the opium cargoes and the opium that was being housed in the warehouses in Canton and elsewhere. So following the opium wars, China is really in a state of economic and social decline. You have, led by Hong Xiuquan in 1850s into the 1860s, you have something called the Taiping Rebellion, which was a peasant uprising reminiscent of the social upheaval that had taken place in China after the Black Death, which resulted in the death of 20 million, mostly Chinese peasants, trying to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Now, the leader of this rebellion that I mentioned, Hong Xiuquan, was an interesting character. If we had longer to discuss, we could explore the fact that he believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This also reflected the influence of Christian missionaries in China at that time, and that he had been sent by Jesus to found the Taiping, or Great Peaceful Dynasty, in China, overthrow the government and establish this kind of millennial sect in China. And now, unfortunately, of course, the name Taiping, Great Peaceful Dynasty, became ironic. 20 million died during this uprising. This is the largest loss of life in the 19th century. Actually, more people died in the Taiping Rebellion than died during the American Civil War that was going on at the same time. But it is an illustration of the crisis, the famines, the epidemics. We've been thinking a lot about pandemics recently that were stalking the countryside in China at that time. And the Qing dynasty was able to hold on to power, but it relied, ironically, on the support of foreign mercenaries, on the support of foreign military advisors and foreign aid. And in response to this crisis, you had this movement which develops in the late 19th century in China, which is known in the West as the self-strengthening movement. This was in Qing society. Many particularly educated people were concerned about the impact of Western science and technology and the prospect of China falling behind the rest of the world, and argued that the best way to learn from the West, which many Chinese regarded still Westerners, Europeans as barbarians, was to adopt barbarian techniques, particularly military technology, against the barbarian, self-strengthening, or if you like, defensive modernization. Now, the problem with the self-strengthening movement, one, is that it had a lot of opposition in China. Many Chinese nationalists believed, for example, that even modest adoption of Western technology was not necessary even late into the 19th century. Then there were others in China who failed to realize that you couldn't really just pick and choose, sort of cherry pick certain aspects of Western technology without industrializing as a society, without undergoing wholesale reform. So again, this self-strengthening movement had certain prospects, but were never realized. And then in 1900, there was a movement called the Boxer Rebellion, which was led by, again, Chinese nationalists who were trying to push particularly Westerners, foreigners off Chinese soil. They were referred to as the Boxers in the Western or the European and American press because they were practitioners of Chinese martial arts. Many people in the West had never seen kung fu movies or anything like that, so they were referred to as Chinese boxers or pugilists. But again, like in the Opium Wars, the Chinese were hopelessly underprepared militarily and were pretty much routed by a combined military force of Britain, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, the United States, and then finally an eighth nation state which joined in the crushing of the Boxer Rebellion. At this time, we started off with Japan. Unlike China, Japan had already modernized and was, by the end of the 19th century, quickly becoming an industrialized imperial power, as you can see by these depictions of Japanese men and women of the 19th century dressing in European style, facial hair, military uniforms, women's fashion, led by the young Meiji Emperor, whose restoration in 1867 resulted in a series of economic reforms which were designed to compete with the West, but would also put Japan on a heading in the 20th century towards conflict and competition, particularly with the United States in the Pacific. So that would be a kind of long road. But when we come back next week, we'll be talking about the First World War and the road to what was called the Great War between the European superpowers. So that's where we'll finish today. Keep well and keep in touch. Thanks very much, folks.